Yeah, so here's the Northwest Territory. It's the land north of the Ohio River. It later on becomes, these different states and part of Minnesota. But what's really important about the Northwest Ordinance is it sets an important precedent. It says when the U.S. gets new land, that new land is going to become new states, not extensions of old states. Right? That's the way this land can be federal land and be sold and make the U.S. government some money. They go ahead and ban slavery in the Northwest Territory. Now, the reason they do this is because during and after the Revolution, all the northern states banned slavery. And the assumption is that since the northern states don't have slavery, the Northwest Territory shouldn't have slavery. Presumably, these sort of areas, they're assuming people are going to move west and that northerners are going to move to the north, from the northeast to what was then the Northwest. Right nowadays, we think of Washington State as the Northwest, and we're right. We are now the Northwest of what is now the United States. But if the United States was ending at the Mississippi River, and back then it was, then this to them was the Northwest, hence why this is the Northwest Ordinance in the Northwest Territory. So they're going to ban slavery in the Northwest Territory because the North at this point doesn't do slavery anymore. They also decide that they're going to set aside some of the land in each of these western states to support public schools. Now, public schools back in the 1600s was just this weird thing that the Puritans did up in New England. But in the 1700s, this idea is catching on in the rest of the North. So a lot of northern states were setting up public schools by now, and since public schools are important to Northerners, just as not having slavery is important to Northerners, the Northwest Ordinance recognizes that. I mean, Jefferson and Madison are Southerners, but they like education. They believe that this will be a better and stronger country if people are more educated. So they throw this in here. So there'll be some land set aside to support public schools out west, and it works. This creates a small but helpful revenue stream for the U.S. government under the Articles of Confederation, and later on it will continue to be a good source of federal money until, for most of American history, until about 1900, the U.S. government's sales of land were like the number 2 source of money for the federal government. So, well done, Northwest Ordinance. But of course, there's still the Southwest. What are we going to do with the land in the Southwest Territory? Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia were still thinking maybe that belonged to them. But no. A couple years later, they passed the Southwest Ordinance. So now these original southern states have a western border, and this is the Southwest Territory. And the Southwest Ordinance is going to do all the same things as the Northwest Ordinance with one major exception, and that major exception being that slavery is legal in the new Southwest Territory. Again, the assumption is that people are going to move west, and so Southerners, some of whom own slaves, if they're moving west, they're going to want to bring their slaves into the Southwest Territory. So taken together, you have the Northwest Ordinance, extending the northern anti-slavery concept to the Northwest Territory, and the South keeping their pro-slavery territory in the Southwest. So, that was the good news on the Articles of Confederation. Here's the bad news. We've actually already covered a lot of the bad news. The Articles of Confederation, the weak government, the ineffective government, the government with severe cash flow problems, that nearly lost the revolution. It was looking really bad there, especially early on. Second, while they're making laws about what's going to happen in the Northwest and Southwest Territory, the fact is the United States didn't control the area yet. Right? Britain, in the Treaty of 1783, said we could have the Ohio country, but the British are still there. The British that they have the Quebecois fur traders, from French Canada, now British-controlled French Canada. The Quebecois are still doing business in the Ohio country, still trading furs with the Indians, and Americans are upset because they feel like that money should be theirs. They're also upset because the product the Indians most valued, the thing they most wanted from the British in the fur trade, was muskets and gunpowder and musket balls, so that they could fight off the American invasion when the American invasion came. So the Americans know that the longer the British are continuing their fur trade, trespassing in the Ohio country that's supposed to belong to us, but really belongs to the Indians, Americans know that the longer that goes on, the stronger the Indians are going to get and the better able to resist. So, yeah. Why is the U.S. helpless? Well, because the government under the Articles of Confederation lacks the power, really, to put together a good army and put an end to this, right? I mean, the government of the Articles of Confederation could barely put together an army good enough to win our independence. They're now completely broke and in debt and in no position to assemble a mighty force to go into the Ohio country and evict the trespassing Brits. Also, the U.S. economy is not in great shape, right? In colonial times, the economy of the 13 colonies was designed to complement the British economy. It was part of the British Empire and designed to fill a role there. But now we're outside the British Empire. We fought for our independence, and during the struggle with Britain, we noticed all the ways that mercantilism, the British economic policy, was cramping our style, but we didn't really see all the ways that it was benefiting us. The tobacco monopoly that benefited southern colonies, the monopolies in fishing and whaling, lumber and shipbuilding that enabled New England and some of the middle colonies to prosper. And now that we're outside the British Empire, and that limits our access to the British market. The British are treating us like a foreign country, and consequently, the U.S. economy isn't recovering quite as fast as people had hoped. I mean, the war, of course, had wrecked the economy, but everyone kind of assumed that when the war was over, the economy would, get back to as good as it was before the war. But it's not, because we're in the wilderness. We're outside the British Empire, trying to make our way in the world, and what we needed was an effective government that could make new trade deals with the British and the French, Spanish, Dutch, other European powers. But the government under the Articles of Confederation is bad at doing that, and it's really confusing because the 13 states are also trying to cut their own trade deals, and Britain and the rest of Europe are confused. They're like, do we need 13 trade deals with 13 states or just one trade deal with the United States? This confusion is, actually hurting the economy. Have a massive war debt racked up and, no real way to repay, just a trickle of money coming in from Western land sales. This means foreign banks and foreign governments that lent us money are angry. And, because years have gone by and they haven't been paid, right? The war, most of the fighting was over by 1781, and then the war was officially over in 1783. But, now several years have passed and still the U.S. isn't paying its debts. There's a danger that foreign banks and governments are going to get so frustrated they might invade to take, what they're not getting paid. And of course, banks in the U.S. that lent money to the war effort are also frustrated. They're like, what gives? The war's been over for a few years. We're ready to get paid. It's really dangerous when rich people are upset with the U.S. government, because when rich people don't like a government, historically, they find a way to replace the government that's not paying them with a government that will pay them. So there's a threat of rich people bankrolling an overthrow of the U.S. government. And then a lot regular Americans also are owed money. Most of the veterans of the Continental Army never got paid in cash for their service. Most of them were paid for most of the war in Revolutionary War bonds, those IOUs. If we win the war, when the government gets its act together, we'll pay you what we owe you, plus interest. But the war's been over for several years now, and no one's getting paid. A lot of the veterans thought they deserved pensions, especially veterans who were disabled in the war, wanted the government to pay them retirement benefits. None are coming. And what about all those farmers and merchants and artisans who had to give up harvests and their inventory to the Continental Army and to state militias during the war because the Army needed to eat and the Army needed supplies? They too got paid mostly in bonds, in IOUs, and they remain unpaid. So there's also a danger that regular people, Revolutionary War veterans, frustrated farmers and merchants and artisans, would also overthrow this government that's not paying them. And this was more than a theoretical danger. There was unrest and violence around this issue in several states. We're going to talk about Massachusetts, where the worst of this action goes down. Episode is called Shays' Rebellion. In this case, you have farmers in western Massachusetts who are angry because their state has raised property taxes. Now, that sounds like a state issue, but it's actually related to the federal issues because a lot of these farmers had given up harvests during the war and hadn't been paid their bonds. Had been paid in bonds, and those bonds haven't been paid. A lot of those farmers were veterans of the Revolutionary War and also had unpaid bonds. And their position was, when the U.S. government pays our bonds, then we can pay, maybe, our state property taxes. But until then, there's no way. Now, when you don't pay taxes, when you don't pay your property taxes, you can get foreclosed on. Now, this requires the government to take you to court, show that you're not paying taxes, and then if they can prove that, then they can seize your property and sell it and use the proceeds to pay off the taxes, and you just lost your property. So what happens here is Daniel Shays, a farmer who's also a Continental Army veteran, leads rebels in taking over courthouses, as shown in the illustration. The farmers figure, if we keep the courts closed, then the judges can't get in the building, and there can't be any foreclosures. So we can hold on to our property. So western Massachusetts is in rebellion, and the state of Massachusetts can't handle the situation. Neither can the U.S. government, right? The U.S. government considers action but decides to stay on the sidelines, decides that this is really a Massachusetts problem. So why can't Massachusetts just use the militia to stop the rebels? Well, the rebels were the militia of western Massachusetts. So this crisis is going to require East Massachusetts to send their militia over to control these rebelling farmers, the militia of West Massachusetts. And, well, frankly, the East Massachusetts militia is not up to the job. So rich folks in Boston and other parts of East Massachusetts hire professional soldiers, private mercenaries, to reinforce the state militia. They march west. The Shays' rebels don't actually put up much of a fight. They see this better army coming at them, and they scatter like roaches when you turn on the lights. So this solved the immediate problem of Shays' rebellion, but you had similar unrest in all 13 states. Something's got to get done. Something's got to change. Shays' rebellion was the wake-up call that made people realize the Articles of Confederation have got to go. We've got to find a better way.